Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Restricted Handling Podcast. Glenn and I are joined today by a new guest to the program, this time helping us talk a little bit more about what's going on in the Iran region. This is someone who specializes in Armenian geopolitics, security, and the direction that Armenia is going. For those who aren't as familiar with Armenia, sits in a pretty tough neighborhood. Borders Iran, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Turkey. It's only lightly separated from Russia. So much influence. And Sarkis Karabashian is joining us today. Sarkis, I'll let you intro yourself a little bit to give more context and background before we jump in.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, first off, I want to thank you both, Glenn and Ryan, for inviting me on the podcast. I actually got to know Glenn a few years back when I was doing a research project with Paula Doyle. She was a professor of mine while I was studying international security at Georgetown University, getting my master's. So yeah, when Glenn, thanks for reaching out because I've been very active since that time. I think we met in 2023 or 2022. So my background consists of many things, but the Armenia related things are as follows. So I started getting involved with Armenia as a teenager and a college student, working with humanitarian organizations. And I started that in 2013 and was consistently going to the country up until 2017. So from those experiences, I actually got to see, looking back on it, a lot of the old regime context of how Armenians were living, what the political situation was like. And then fast forward to 2021, after the 2020 war, um, that war brought a massive amount of attention to Armenia, especially from the diaspora like myself. So I started paying very close attention. And then during the period of 2020 to 2023, I was at Georgetown and specializing more and more in the Armenian related issues while everybody was focusing on Russia, Ukraine. So I ended up actually doing some research with a think tank in DC, focusing on the Armenia US strategic partnership that was developing since the Biden administration and then was adopted by the Trump administration. So in that research, I interviewed about 41 different people in Armenia, ranging from military personnel to leaders to government personnel, low and high ranking, then private individuals, private sector, business leaders, political candidates, everything under the sun. So I can get this full scope perspective of what the country is and is becoming. And then following that, I actually started a international program that brings the future, or not future, but brings master students from the top international relations programs in DC to Armenia for a week, where I organize high level briefings with Armenian and American personnel in country so that they can learn and get a candid view of of Armenia and what's going on. Because if you look into the news about Armenia or try to learn about the country, you'll get very limited quality information, and then there's a lot of information that's not of even medium quality. So I started doing this as an effort to kind of arm the next generation of decision makers, diplomats, NatSec personnel with firsthand knowledge and experience in country, because I think that's where the best quality info comes from.
Thank you. Maybe just as I kick us off here, for when people listen to this, we're several weeks into the U.S. War with Iran. I'm sure if I asked you this question, Sarkis, like 5 months ago, maybe the answer is different. But today, given where Armenia sits geographically, what's maybe the primary focus for that country right now? Is it Iran to the south? Is it still Russia? You've written extensively on Russia as it pertains to Armenia, or is it something else entirely? Just to situate us.
Yeah, man. I was recently in Armenia about 2 weeks ago when all this with all the when the war US and Iran began. So, it was very interesting to be meeting with a high level personnel in country, and that surprisingly was not the bulk of our conversations at all. It was certainly mentioned and it was certainly discussed forefront, like, in the beginning of our conversations. But then a lot of the info in our briefings was focused on what is Armenia's continued trajectory, national security priorities, and economic priorities. So I would say Iran, like maintaining neutral and friendly relations with Iran is a priority for Armenia because it is one of two outlets for trade and transport. Because if you look to the left, if you're looking at a map and you look left and right of Armenia, over 80% of its border is covered by Azerbaijan and Turkey, who have maintained a consistent blockade since the 90s with Armenia. So Georgia is the most open portal to the world for Armenia, and Iran is a partially open portal where Armenia has to walk a very thin line managing sanctions, but also doing business that's kosher with Iran in light of these sanctions. So there is a understanding from the West that Armenia is in a very difficult spot. So a huge priority right now that exists for Armenia's leaders is to, and also society, like you can look at the data, I think IRI just posted it 2 weeks ago as well, is opening borders between Turkey and Armenia. I think that's a big one, or getting more economic expansion. In terms of the war with Iran, there was some side conversations I had where they, with different people at different times, where they essentially said they want Armenia to be the staging ground for diplomacy between Iran and the West at best, but they prefer to stay out of things and not get pulled in to this vortex. Just Armenia cannot handle it right now, and it doesn't. I don't think they want it at all. But it's not been the first time that this has happened for Armenia.
Well, it's nice to see you, Sarkis. And Ryan, how are you? I think maybe it might be good just to give a quick overview of Armenia and the region and some of the challenges. And then, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a very dynamic shift. And my own assessment is we're on the cusp of a major development for the United States, for Armenia, and for Azerbaijan. I think one of the reasons that Sarkis and I were attracted to one another is because we had come from different backgrounds in the same region. And I was personally, I've said this before publicly, I'll say it again, the current government in Armenia and the prime minister deserve a lot of respect. I think they're taking incredible steps, which are courageous, to bring Armenia out of the bubble or the monopoly that Russia had and Iran to some extent had. So Sarkis, can you just give like maybe a quick overview of the region, some of the history, just going back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then why Armenia is so important? Of course, we have a huge community here in the United States and Europe, culturally important in the United States, politically important, and why Armenia now we're on the verge of Armenia becoming a strategic partner for the United States, which is something 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I could never have imagined, given that Russia, the domination Russia had over Armenia and Armenian politics.
Yeah, and not to correct you in any.
No, correct me.
Please correct him. No, I'm joking.
Correct me.
Armenia is a official strategic partner of the United States. It happened in, I think, this last day of the Biden administration, and then the Trump administration carried it forward. So, but I think it was the last week or day of it. But it had been something developed by the Biden administration for a bit and then was finalized. But yeah, I can give you I'll do my best to be concise, because if you want me to talk from 90s to present, I'm going to give you inflection points. I think that's something Paula always told me to frame things in my analysis, was be concise and follow inflection points.
By the way, Sarkis, you're under a lot of pressure because she was a guest on the program recently and
Oh,
she got a lot of viewers.
Fantastic.
I
So,
listened
but as a
to.
student, you can surpass her.
Let's see if
Audience,
I
if you're out there, help Sarkis. Tell your friends.
can. Yeah, Paula's amazing, and I listened to the podcast. Very, very interesting. Yeah, her expertise is insane. So, for Armenia and the region, so obviously 1991 was a big year for the world, and especially for that region, because the Soviet Union ended up collapsing. So, what the collapse of the Soviet Union thrusted Armenia and Georgia and Azerbaijan into a completely new era of trying to establish some sort of independence and sovereignty. To be honest with you, Armenia from the 90s up until 2018, politically, economically, and militarily, and it was considered a little Russia. And this was very, very normal rhetoric, even used in the West, in the United States, in national security circles. It's not my words, it's just what it was. And you see this because Armenia's entire national security apparatus and military was Russian based. Russian bases were on Armenian soil. Russian troops / border guards were in Armenia's international airport. They were on the borders of Turkey and Armenia. They were on the borders of Iran and Armenia. I've seen them myself. They were on the border of Georgia and Armenia. They were managing the entire security apparatus for the country. And then on top of that, the political leaders of the time, Sarkis Karabashian, Robert Kocharian, they had very, very close ties to the Kremlin and to Putin on a personal basis. And you saw almost all of the infrastructure that was major to Armenia sold to Russian entities. And also just in a realistic way, because of the neighborhood and geography, Armenia and Azerbaijan and Georgia naturally depend on economic relations with Russia. And that'll be something that always is. But there's certain levels to it. But essentially, because of that, Armenia was very, very much a extension of Russia. And then Georgia had its conflicts with Russia. So there was this strategic layer that Armenia played in Russia's conflicts with Georgia, but not that much so, not as much as people think, but it was definitely something in the background. There was a few inflection points that happened in the 90s and 2000s. One was the Nagorno-Karabakh War. And that was essentially won by the perspectives of many scholars on this. It was essentially won by the Armenian side, but was ended and resulted in a ceasefire that was negotiated by Russia, which was just the norm for that region. And then you had a ceasefire similar to North and South Korea, where you would have border clashes every so often or every day. I could say, like, overwhelmingly from an objective point of view, not from an Armenian American point of view, the majority of those clashes were happening from Azerbaijan to Armenia. And this is confirmed by many international sources. And so on top of that, you had a 2016 4-day war. And that was the first time you saw drones used in the battlefield between Armenia and Azerbaijan from Azerbaijan. And the type of warfare being fought from the 90s up until 2020 was essentially trench warfare. There's lines drawn in the sand where they had soldiers, artillery batteries, et cetera, et cetera. And then in 2020, you see a major inflection point with the war breaking out and Azerbaijan utilizing military hardware that it mainly acquired from Israel and Turkey. Again, you can look this up on CIPRI, open source. You can see at least the public purchases made, mainly from loitering munitions to high altitude drones to low altitude, like class 2 ISR drones. Like there is a lot purchased from Azerbaijan, including getting manufacturing rights from Israel to manufacture these types of drones and loitering munitions in Azerbaijan locally. On top of that, Israel provided geospatial coverage for the battlefields via Israeli Aeronautics Inc. And so you have a very close relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan that formed essentially for arms and oil. This has been written about. I wrote something privately about this too when it was happening, but that's essentially why the war was won very decisively and quickly by the Azerbaijani side, and Armenia had nothing to combat it with at all. There's nothing procured because 90+% of Armenia's military hardware, was procured from, guess who? Russia.
Sarkis, real quick, the war you're talking about now, is that 2016 or 2020?
2020. So the 2020,
Okay, yeah.
the 2020 44-day war completely uncovered for the world to see the massive inadequacies of the Armenian military and the disparity that existed. In 2016, they saw drones on the battlefield, but the military brass of Armenia's side was essentially made up of very Russified, old, obese. If you've been to Eastern Europe, when you get a military promotion, they joke about it like you get an office and you get a belly. And so all the high brass military personnel of 2016 to 2020 were all these Russified, Sovietized personnel.
I have to say, Sarkis, if we have any listeners out there that are old East European military leaders, we can offer certain, get up a life or weight loss programs, or
Yeah.
we're not intending to insult anybody, but yes, I would agree with you. Not in the best physical condition,
Yeah.
and thought wise, not the most forward leaning
At all.
not the most innovative.
And like the state of the Armenian military, I can't say much on the Azerbaijan military. They're like, I can say more, but I'll stick to the Armenian one. The Armenian military, essentially prior to 2020, and even a few years post 2020, but prior to 2020, was like, when I've interviewed soldiers, like low ranking soldiers, they had horror stories. Like there was suicides, there was beatings, people were beaten to death, people wouldn't get paid, there was not much food to go around, and it would be pilfered and sold. And then on the higher ranking side, and you can Google this again, like if you want to come at me in the comments, it's fine. But just Google it. Like you had the former minister of defense literally was feeding military rations to his pet bear. Like that's just, if that personifies what was going on, it's extreme. So and then I had a contact who was in the drone industry back in the mid 2010s, who presented his drones to the Ministry of Defense, and they laughed him out of the room, saying, "What is this toy?" And it was a level 1 drone, sure, but it could carry a payload and do ISR, which is pretty forward leaning for the time. But they laughed him out of the room, and they were also like most likely taking cuts out of their own budget on these arms purchases that were exclusively with Russia. So I don't want to talk too much about that, because that's like more just military side of things. But the following inflection point happened after the war. Guess who brokered the ceasefire yet again? Russia. And what came of that ceasefire was peacekeeper presence of Russian peacekeepers from 2020. And the original plan, I think, was to keep them there for 5 to 10 years with another installment of 5 following years. But the initial period, I think, was guaranteed 5 years. And so they deployed these peacekeepers to Nagorno-Karabakh, aka known as Artsakh to the Armenians. And they established basically a perimeter and checkpoints at the Lachin corridor, which is this single vessel that connected Armenia, the sovereign nation of Armenia, with the Armenians that remained in Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh. So from 2020 to 2023, there's peacekeepers that are supposed to maintain peace. But you saw a total breakdown in this peacekeeping force once the Ukraine war started, because Russia started diverting all of its resource and attention to the war. So you saw things like, because prior to this, Armenia's military strategy wasn't soured by Russia. They just realized there was disparity in tech, but there wasn't a souring of relations between Russia and Armenia just yet. The souring of relations occurred in a few moments. It occurred when it occurred in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, where the Russians failed to maintain peacekeeping operations and essentially gave Azerbaijan the ability to entirely encircle and capture what was left. Before that, there was a few moments where Armenia proper in 2022 and I believe in 2023, post the collapse of Artsakh, where Azerbaijan and Turkey were, by proxy Turkey, were getting ready for a full-scale invasion of the southern part of Armenia known as Syunik, which I think in its max width is like 25 miles. These were these inflection points where Turkey and Azerbaijan threatened Armenia's sovereignty, and Russia didn't show up because Armenia is part of the CSTO, which is, for people that don't know what that is, it's Russia's NATO, and Russia had obligations to protect Armenia, and it didn't follow through on those obligations. Post 2023, the prime minister of Armenia, he came to the realization, along with his advisors and other head personnel, that they needed to change their entire security strategy. And so they didn't cut relations with Russia. They just stopped giving them the monopoly over the relations and security. So they started make their first purchase. You saw the indicators of this breakdown in security relations were in arms purchases. You saw major arms purchases in 2020, late 2022, throughout 23 and 24 from India and France. I think Slovakia was one of them too. And then most recently, the United States. But that's something we get into later. I'm giving you a snapshot of like 2023. And then once the collapse of Russian dominance over Armenia's security apparatus fell, then you see Armenia essentially start to adopt new security partners and relations. So France and India were the first. there's a lot geopolitically in common with these countries and Armenia, both historically and with an interest. And this is a region of realpolitik, and that's just the reality. And then Armenia came and Armenia-US relations came very, very soon after that. Starting in 2024, they heightened, and that's when that strategic partnership was developing. And that partnership was developing because the United States was seeing the threat to Armenia's actual sovereignty that there was, because Azerbaijan and Turkey saw Armenia is completely naked defense wise. So why not take it?
All this is happening, right? The prime minister, Pashinyan, he makes the decision to start moving away from Russia. And let's be clear, this is very risky, all right, to do this. And you've been traveling back and forth, you know the situation on the ground. A lot of our people that follow us are very interested in what we call the gray zone, right? Or active measures, Russian active measures, how the Russians are trying to undermine the government, whether it's through different opposition figures or media. Have you seen that in Armenia in the last few years? Are you seeing a lot of pressure being put on the prime minister and his leadership team and trying
Yeah.
to sway public opinion, propaganda, all that kind of stuff?
Well, like you can look at most diaspora media, and there's very, very little positive sentiment towards him in any of the diaspora produced media. And that's, I think, pretty intentional, because most of the diaspora produced media is related to or represented by, or the writers are part of, diaspora organizations that ultimately represent a opposition political party known as the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, so which has a very small presence and has next to no positive public sentiment with actual Armenians in the country who vote. It's very much a diasporan anomaly, and not anomaly, it's very much a diasporan thing. But yeah, that's one. But then actually in country, you're seeing a lot of disinformation attempts in media, and the government had to kind of counter that by shutting down one of the like Russian sponsored news media sites or providers. I think that happened in 2024 or early 25. But there's definitely a media war. But if you look at polling data from IRI, which is pretty strong, the sentiment towards Russia is completely abysmal. Even the like population of Armenians from Artsakh, who were arguably the most pro-Russian Armenians that you could find, had the same, not same, but they definitely have decreased in their support for being pro-Russia.
Mhm.
But I think there's the sentiments against Pashinyan come from a lost war. And if you go to Armenia, you'll ask any person or family, they've lost a brother, husband, son, or uncle to the war. You won't find a single person that hasn't. And
Right.
so I think that, and on the Azerbaijani side, the same thing. So that's why when the war was lost and people say Pashinyan signed it away, that's not factually true,
Right.
because the leaders of Artsakh signed it away after they
Right.
lost the war. Like, you lose a war, you don't get negotiating terms, but you don't have leverage.
Right.
Yeah, there's been a lot of Russian disinformation or a lot of Russian attempts. Also, in Armenia, you can't audit or look into who's financing political parties. It's kind of open season. I wouldn't say Russia is the only player in financing political parties. And I don't want to talk about countries as if they're like monolithic, because like these are business interests at play. So if you have some like Russian oligarch that has 60% stake in a mine in Armenia, obviously they're going to want the pro-Russia candidate, or a candidate that will be more susceptible to corruption.
Right.
So I think it goes more to that level of granularity rather than the Kremlin wants Armenia. I think there's way more complexity and nuance to it in the business sector.
Glenn, with your background and expertise on Russia and Turkey, when would Armenia come up in this context as you were involved with those two powers? How would it come up? What did you have to be tuned into?
Well, one thing I would say is, one, there's a very large Armenian population in Russia. Many of the Armenians in Russia are very successful, especially in the banking sector, very capable, talented. And so there's kind of an Armenian lobby in Russia. The Russians, my experience, they did the same thing to the Azeris. They put pressure on that community to try and blackmail the government in Armenia. They do this to the Jews, they do it to Israel, they do it to the Azeris, and they do it to the Armenians. It's kind of an MO that I saw over the years. In Turkey, what I saw in Turkey going back to 2020 is the Turks were very interested. Sarkis mentioned the blockade. The blockade was put up during the first Nagorno-Karabakh war. Turks said in unity with the Azeris, they said, okay, look, we're going to close the border with Armenia until Armenia surrenders Nagorno-Karabakh, which they consider to occupied territory, right? And so for years the border has been closed, but the Turks in recent years have been saying, we want to open the border. We see it as a benefit for Armenia because Armenia is isolated. We see value in Turkey. By the way, there's also a large Armenian population in Turkey and a very ugly history, but also the Armenians in Turkey also play an important role, right? And the Turks are saying, let's open the border. Let's get business going. To do that, we need a peace agreement between Baku and Yerevan. And so I see the Turks, this is my own assessment, in recent years playing a more or less forward-leaning role. I know many Armenians have very, very bad memories of what happened in the Ottoman Empire. And of course, the war in Nagorno-Karabakh was also a bloody war. Atrocities committed on both sides. This is me speaking. And on the Azeri side, for years, the Azeris felt like they were being mistreated by the international community because the UN considered Nagorno-Karabakh Azerbaijani territory, which was occupied by a separatist government. It wasn't the government of Armenia, right? It was Artsakh. So it was like a proxy. So maybe you can think of the Donbass, right? Where the Russians tried to create a proxy government. And one of the things that Prime Minister Pashinyan did, which I thought was very courageous, is he said after the third war, and I agree with Sarkis, he really didn't have many cards to play, but he said, I'm not going to go to war because the government in Artsakh wanted him to send Armenian troops to save them. And he said, I'm not going to risk all of Armenia for Nagorno-Karabakh. And maybe that's a very simplified response, but he said, we need to focus on making Armenia healthy and strong. And he, of course, when he did that, that made him very unpopular with some people. And you can imagine now, if you try and put it in the context of Ukraine right now, anybody in Ukraine that says we're going to have to give up some territory to make a peace agreement is going to face a lot of internal political and external political criticism. But that's one of the reasons I just have incredible respect for the Prime Minister of Armenia, because he took a step in the direction of peace, which was very, very courageous. And I'm glad to see, as Sarkis said, the U.S. got a little bit more involved during the Biden administration and now during the Trump administration. And we should talk about the trip, right? This economic corridor that President Trump has announced. And I know, Sarkis, maybe you could talk about that because you touched on the business piece. And this goes to this administration's view of, commercial diplomacy, kind of using U.S. business to play a leading role in solidifying peace or a development between countries. Can you talk about the trip? What is, I don't know if most Americans are tracking this.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting.
I also want to validate everything you said, absolutely true. And it's important to also look at things like Nagorno-Karabakh and the international relations that surround this is very realpolitik, because there's a lot of people that make institutional based arguments for the existence of a sub-state or not. But at the end of the day, this region is dictated by realpolitik. So yeah, and I think with Trip, to answer your question, the Trump road for international peace and prosperity is a very interesting piece of Trumpian diplomacy, and I think a very effective one. Because if there's something that I've observed from my perspective is that this region has a incredible amount of, I would say, I don't know if respect is the right word, but they take the Trump administration very seriously. The Russians weren't able to wrangle in the problems that were occurring in the southern part of Armenia and the threats to it. The United States was. In 2022 and 2023, you saw tangible threats mounted up by Azerbaijan and Turkey against Armenia's sovereignty. And Russia couldn't call them off. Iran couldn't call them off. The United States did. And there was a covert example of an individual who I can't name, who happened to be on his way to Baku at the time when the U.S. Embassy and the individuals in DC were observing the same thing. They're observing a military buildup on both sides of Syunik and Armenia in general by Turkey and Azerbaijan. And they said, yeah, it may be time to evacuate the embassy. And the United States was able to overtly respond with Nancy Pelosi going to Armenia and then also enacting this joint military cooperation with Eagle Partner and the Armed Forces of Armenia. And then covertly, there was an individual on his way to do business with the West and Baku, and he had a meeting with President Aliyev at the time, and he was asked to talk him off the ledge of going to war, and he did. So when people want to say the U.S. didn't care or didn't have any involvement, like that's the involvement that I know about, and so you can do with that what you may. So TRIP was created as a way to solve an issue that was ongoing, and this issue is known as the Zangezur question. So if you look at a map, a topographical map, the border between Azerbaijan and Armenia is extremely mountainous. It's the lower Caucasus or the southern Caucasus. And it is pretty impassable. There's three routes through, one top, one in the middle, and then one at the bottom of where the border of Armenia and Iran is. It's the lowest point. It's been used since even the Persian Empire and Roman Empire as a key transportation point for goods between the Caspian Sea and Mediterranean Black Sea. So it's a very strategic point. I've been there. It's the only flat part in that area, and then it gets immediately more mountainous. So it's where the Araks River runs. Very interesting place, and you can go there. It's awesome. But this place is under threat because Azerbaijan wanted a corridor that connected it with its exclave known as Nakhchivan. And if you look at a map again, you'll see a little blob of land to the left, southern left part of Armenia, and that is a part of Azerbaijan. Internationally recognized, it is a Stalinist era relic when he redrew the maps, and but it is historically an Armenian inhabited place. But things happen, and unfortunately, there's this blob of Azerbaijan that flanks the lower left side of Armenia, and then you have Azerbaijan to the right. So there's this desire for these two to connect because that area is very, very impoverished. It's basically a fiefdom, and Azerbaijan wants to provide more goods and resources to it. Now, you can ask yourself, you can ask why, and there's probably a few answers why that are good and bad. But Azerbaijan ended up wanting to use force to create this corridor. And Iran was able to negotiate a railroad that ran through Iran to this exclave, but that still wasn't enough. The Aliyev regime wanted more. And so the Trump administration saw an opportunity to create a point of peace for his record of peacemaking, because that's a thing he ran on for his campaign, which is an important thing that is a good thing. So this conflict came up, and he ended up within a very short period of time in talking to the parties. I think within like a 10-day period, they established meetings in Washington, had an agreement ready, signed the agreement, and then established the announcement of the Trump Road for International Peace and Prosperity, which is a 99-year lease that the U.S. owns on this corridor between Azerbaijan through Armenia to the exclave of Nakhchivan. It's 74% owned by, it's a 74-26 ratio of ownership, but Armenia owns the security on this. So that was the core part of this. And Azerbaijan did not want that. Azerbaijan wanted to have the entire right to security over the entire corridor, but that's just not how sovereign nations work. So that's what they got. It's meant to be a transport corridor, and it's in this broader idea of having Armenia be a crossroads for peace that Prime Minister Pashinyan has put up throughout the years. That is, if you look up Crossroads for Peace, you'll find a visual of Armenia. It's very blue, and it shows you all the roads that could connect the entire South Caucasus region together via Armenia to create more international connectivity and transport and improve economy.
It's amazing how much progress has been made, but there's still no finalized peace agreement, right, between Baku and Armenia, Yerevan.
It's a peace agreement framework that's been agreed upon. So it's a framework. So I think that's important for people to know. This region's a weird region. I think in our American mindset, we think of treaties as the definitive thing that brings about tangible outcomes, but you've seen some tangible outcomes already happen from this framework. You had the first transport of wheat, Russian wheat, via railroad from the Zangezur corridor, the trip route from Azerbaijan through Armenia and to Armenia. And then you also had now for the first time ever, Azerbaijani energy products being exported to Armenia. Like, you can go near Zvartnots airport, there's a Shell gas station that services Azerbaijani oil. That's, I think, a tangible outcome of this trip and the power of relations. Now, is that limited? Could that just be for show? Absolutely. Like, I think until borders open up and military positions are retired or on both sides of the border, I think that's when, and replaced with, let's say, border security that's less armed to the teeth, I think that's when you'll understand if peace is truly happening or not. But I don't think, from a personal point of view, I don't know if I even want to say this, but I'm not sure if Azerbaijan truly wants it, because the Aliyev regime has used this conflict as a political tool. And I think, Glenn, you know more about this than me, but they've used this conflict as a political tool to rally people around the flag. And anytime the conflict's settled down, then the people of Azerbaijan want more from their government. They protest, then the internet shuts down. No one hears anything for 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden there's peace again in Azerbaijan, in Baku. So I think this is a useful tool for Azerbaijan that if they lose, I think the Aliyev regime fears.
Glenn, can I come to you? So I want to come back to you, Sarkis, on what you think Armenia should be doing now, given what's going on in their neighborhood. But first, Glenn, for those who aren't familiar, why is it that, and I know this goes back a long time, I'm sure, but that Turkey and Armenia were not closer? And what is it that has driven that position and posturing over time?
Well, I mean, there's a very, very complicated, ugly history, which, the Armenian community calls the Armenian genocide, which the Turks called the so-called Armenian genocide. There's a big historic debate between communities on whether there was a genocide or not a genocide. And I don't want to go like that right there. You could do like a serious deep dive podcast, Ryan, and it would be like very controversial for somebody. What I would say is that during the First World War, as the Ottoman Empire was kind of falling apart, there were definitely atrocities committed against the Armenian community that lived inside of the borders of the Ottoman Empire, right? And again, you have to really pick apart the history. It's very, very complex, but there was a very, very bad history. And so I think many Armenians remember that. Of course, then there are territorial disputes. Some Armenians talk about a greater Armenia, which encompass part of what is today Turkey. I see Sarkis kind of gave it a look, but Azerbaijan and Armenia arguing over Nagorno-Karabakh, other parts of the South Caucasus. So it's a super, super complex issue. But in a nutshell, when we talk about modern relations, again, it goes back to the first Nagorno-Karabakh war. Azerbaijan, when it established, we have to remember, Azerbaijan, they're a Turkic people. And the old Azeri president, the former president, Gaydar Aliyev, had a saying. It said, two states, one people, because they're Turks, right? And so when they got their independence, Turkey was the first country really to establish close ties with Azerbaijan. And when the war started and when Armenian forces took Nagorno-Karabakh, then the Turks closed the border in solidarity with Baku. And that's been the kind of blockade that's existed for many, many years. So, very, very complicated. But I will say this to the Armenians that are watching, there are communities all over the Middle East, Armenian communities, like Syrian Armenians. In Beirut, the best food, now all the Lebanese are going to hate me, but the best food is in a place called Borshamud, which is the Armenian enclave in Beirut, right? And it's a great place. One of my favorite places in the world. Super dynamic, great food, and great people. So, and you have Armenians, now in Europe, especially in France, of course, in the United States. So there's a big Armenian community in the U.S. And many of them fled when the Ottoman Empire was kind of collapsing.
I'm just wondering, like, it seems like they're in an advantageous position today with what's going on perhaps in the region where regional powers are either preoccupied, maybe not as prominent as they were before, and you've got the Trump administration in power.
Mhm.
Is there an opportunity for Armenia here, given what's going on regionally?
Yeah, with like in regards to Iran, I think there. If I again, I don't know the information that the top leaders of Armenia know. So I'm going to speak definitely from ignorance here. If I was an Armenian official, I would be looking at ways to offer communication between Iran and the United States and Israel, either on soil or externally in secure environments. I think that's one very strong way that Armenia could position itself for what it desires to be, which is a nation at peace that's stable, that is a transport based state or transportation slash goods exchange based state. I also think that I say this out of ignorance, but from what I see, I think that Armenia's government should start understanding what it is that they could offer to the United States in terms of business opportunities, because there's a lot of expectation for, because again, Armenia's government's a young one. The country in general is not used to being a sovereign nation and acting as one. So learning how to govern a nation is very difficult. The Pashinyan generation and is the first to do it, essentially, at least in this context. So I would be asking, what is it that exists in Armenia that we can leverage to assist the United States in goals that are mutual interest? And I know that they're trying. In my interactions with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Armenia, like they have some very bright people there that are committed to the nation of Armenia, who are absolute patriots for their country and want to see it flourish and be secure and have better relations. I just think within respect to the United States, those and Iran, that's definitely something there. There are limits to Armenia's relationship with Russia too. Like it has to trade with Russia. There's until Armenia somehow achieves full self sufficiency, it's not going to stop trading with Russia. And I think the United States and other Western powers understand this, but it'll always be, at least in the near future, a point of leverage that Russia has against Armenia. So I think the goal that's being pursued right now, and this is less of a recommendation, more of an observation, is that the Armenian government's figuring out how to reduce this dependency and diversify. They don't want to stop trading with Russia, but they just want to be able to trade with other people, or sorry, other countries, so that one, there's not a single point of failure for your light natural gas,
Yeah.
or that your exports of wine to Russia aren't just stopped at a border in Georgia for political reasons.
But I would say that one, you mentioned, I just read an article the other day about how Armenian wine is now beginning to get a lot of positive attention. So another, I know Ryan's out in California, like in Northern California, so people out there may get mad at me if I say that there's some competition. But I definitely want to try some Armenian wine. I've had some in the Middle East before, but my understanding it's beginning to get very popular. In fact, there's a big wine festival going on right now in Armenia, and I saw there was a delegation of French what do they call diggers going. I just upset the whole French speaking community. No, listen, this is obviously a very, very complex issue. It's super important. One of the things I told you, Sarkis, and why I think we appreciate you being on the program is we're trying to bring some of these issues to the attention of Americans who may not be tracking like all the intricacies. And would love to have you on again in the future, maybe do a little bit more of a deep dive. People in the audience, send us questions if you have any questions that we can, use in the future. But, given the timing of this is also very important because what's happening in Iran right now, Armenia is definitely impacted, and like other countries on the periphery of Iran. And there's an Armenian community in Iran, so that we shouldn't forget that either. And it's not about Iran here; we're talking about Armenia, but it's all interconnected, right? And it's one of my most favorite regions of the world after Long Island. What are you laughing at? Long
That's
Island's
another great
nice.
wine producer.
A lot of whining, not wine, but
Yeah.
whining. No, but it really is like, and it's beautiful, incredibly beautiful. Like tourism wise, Armenia has incredible potential because it is just gorgeous. I mean, the Caucasus are
Yeah.
stunning.
Yeah, it's safe, very natural, very raw, and very like affordable to go to. I'd love to host you sometime, but I can tell you,
You heard that. You heard that, audience.
yeah, I'd love to host you, and you can
We're
come
in.
on the trip I do next year if you'd like. And so, but I do want to like say something in regards to Iran and the Armenian diaspora that exists in Iran. It's quite substantial, but I think the biggest threat to the Armenian diaspora in Iran is not the Iranian regime. It could be what comes after it, maybe, but that's a low likelihood. I'd say moderate to high likelihood is spillover from airstrikes from the United States and other related parties that you're probably very well aware of. But I won't say any particular nation because it's nations that are participating in this. So I know that there are organizations that have been in touch with the current administration to notify the White House of, hey, this is where the Armenian diaspora area like clusters are. Please, like know this as you plan
Wow.
strikes.
Interesting.
Because Armenians, and you can ask any Armenian worldwide, they always are catching strays when war happens. Lebanon, Syria, like it's very, very common. And like Burj Hamid, as an amazing of a place it is, then a lot of them have left. So like your favorite place in the world for food is severely affected by the war that the Lebanese have experienced too.
Right, right.
So I think for Armenians, diasporans in any of these countries, it's never typically the local government or regime that's in charge that's threatening to them. It's catching strays from war. So I
Right.
think that's the biggest concern I have on a personal basis for the Armenians of Iran and other minority groups is that they, they catch strays. That's it.
That's a great point.
Thank you so much for taking the time with us, Sarkis. This is great.
Yeah.
We'll have maps up, so all the stuff you were describing, people will be able to orient. This has been great. I hope maybe if you make it out west, let's get some Armenian wine, actually, if we can find it
Absolutely.
somewhere.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, man.
I'll my shelf and bring it with me when I come out west in a week or two.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.